And it's a good thing because I'm over here and can't play the video.
I'm surprised.
I know.
I thought that there would be some AER based on last week, so maybe nobody listened.
We got some feedback from the listener of the question about has the Bible, has Paul's writing been overreached compared to Jesus' words, and they were really happy with our answer.
Oh, somebody talked to you about that.
Yeah. So the asker ended up coming into the church. And
did you know who they were ahead of time?
I did not. I didn't know until after. I was like, oh, that was such a good question. If you keep sending in questions like that, that would be awesome. So I encourage them to keep sending more, like anybody should.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah. Well, that's pretty cool.
All right.
I glanced down at question 120, and I was like, well, that's going to be an interesting one.
There you go. All right. Well, let's start at 114, which is where we are. In the magical world of numbering for the Q&A podcast. I like that we got numbers now.
Better than GGG.
GGG, yeah.
Which is always better than XXX.
Yes. Although we may get more listeners that week if we posted what questions we're talking about.
All right, this question, this could be good. Our brick...
Or maybe not.
Well, no, as I read the first line, I think of, okay, here we go. Are brick and mortar churches doomed to exist? I heard a rumor that younger church members are tithing less and less, and with older members not being around to do that forever, will church as we know it fall? And if so, what changes could churches make to remain relevant, if you will?
Yes.
I think if churches make changes to remain relevant, they've already lost.
I would say our brick and mortar church is doomed to exist.
Yes.
Yes.
I agree.
I hate to sound like a doomsayer, and I want to begin by saying the Church of Jesus Christ will never fail.
Jesus promised that.
Yes.
Yep.
Right? The gates of hell itself will not prevail against the church.
Yep.
However, over the last 2,000 years, the church has undergone radical change through different seasons. 500 years ago, there was a radical change that we call the Reformation. Not all the changes were good. In the 3rd century, there was a radical change when it became the state religion of Rome, which was not a good radical change. If you do some of the reading that I do, you hear a lot of people talk about the end of Christendom, which... what they're talking about is not the end of the Christian church, but the end of the Christendom.
Christian culture domination.
That really began in the 3rd century with Constantine making Christianity the state religion. And as a result, Christianity had in Europe and then in North America a lot of influence, a lot of power. And that is fading quickly, if it's not already completely gone in some circles. And the result of that is a beautiful opportunity for the church to rebirth something that it hasn't had for 1,700 years, which is to be a very countercultural, the countercultural movement that it started out as. There's a beautiful opportunity in front of us. However, having said that, the challenge when anything is ending or anything is dying is we grieve that and we want to cling to it. And I see a lot of people who do want to cling to Christendom and want to still engage in the culture wars and still fight to have a maintain the Christian culture that we need to have. But I think if you look at Europe, where the churches are, I don't say museums because there's nothing in there, but just tourist attractions that people walk in and look at the cathedrals. And having had the opportunity to walk through Rome, there's a church on every corner.
Right.
Like, there's a lot of churches. Lorelei and I were just walking one day. We're like, hey, here's a church. Hey, here's a church. And you just walk in and like, not like Living Springs, but like crazy, ornate cathedrals.
Right.
And there's one every 6 blocks, and you're in the same town as the Vatican. Like, it's like nobody ever built just, you know, a Walmart box store church. It just didn't happen. And they're all empty. And where Europe is in many ways just 20 to 40 years, maybe 50 years ahead of North America.
And then I'd say Canada is a few years ahead of where America will be.
Yes.
In most standards,
yes,
right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. over my lifetime.
Yeah.
Yes, there's Europe, then Canada, then America.
Yeah.
As far as the direction that culture has been going.
Yeah.
Canada has typically made the shifts before the States has on social issues and on lots of other things as well, and even just trends in demographics. But having said all that, it's not all bad news.
I watched Blake leading in, ready to go.
Do you want to say something, Blake?
Well, I just, not playing devil's advocate, just a thought that I had as you were saying that. Because I heard this, I don't know, a while ago on a podcast talking about Constantine and talking about the, church becoming state-run and all the rest. That if Christianity is what we believe it to be, if it is true, if God is real, then people will continue to get saved or believe in Christ, right? And influential people will continue to get saved and believe in Christ. But when they do, as Constantine did, they bring what they have already experienced in life with them. So I think, yes, I agree with everything you say, but then I also go, well, could it just rise up again? Like, depending on how long our world lasts, this dies out.
Oh, absolutely.
Will not it just become a state-run thing again at some point? Because influential people will become Christians.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we've talked about in our Revelation series is how Revelation is not so much an end times thing, but is very relevant to our lives. And one of the things about Revelation is that the book of Revelation repeats itself.
Over and over again.
Babylon falls, Babylon falls, people rebuild Babylon. Yep. Babylon falls, people rebuild Babylon. Yeah. So, absolutely. Yeah. If Jesus doesn't return for 5 or 10,000 more years. Yeah. Absolutely. In 2,000 years, they might be right where we are right now. Yeah. So, but it's not going to happen in our lifetime.
Yeah, I was thinking that. Yeah,
that's what I'm just speaking in our lifetime.
I was going to say one thing I felt convicted of in a number of our conversations that I failed to mention that I think is really relevant to this conversation. We often think, and it's natural to do so within our North American context and even European context, as we've mentioned. But the global weight of the church has shifted to Asia and to South America now. That there are more Christians
and Africa
in those places than there are in North America and the Western world combined. Where those churches are exploding and booming. They're building churches. They're doing those things now. Is it South Korea that has a majority population that's Christian by like a long shot?
Really?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
And so the weight of Christianity is shifting out of the Christendom known world and shifting to other places where our context, I would argue, needs a refreshing, while those ones are already going through building up of something new. Phyllis Tickle, I know I've mentioned this book a few times, The Great Emergence. She writes a book every 500 years since Jesus' ministry, there has been a refreshing in the church, and we're right around that time now, 5 or 6 years past the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, where after 500 years of anything, we build up enough crap that we just need to kind of reset it, would be anything. I remember having a conversation with somebody about they were really frustrated and talking down about the Catholic Church, and aren't we glad that our denomination hasn't picked up so many things? I said, give Pentecostals 2,000 years and we'll have way more stuff. We've already got 3/4 of the list with 200 years of a movement, let alone 2,000, that there needs to be a coming and going. There will always be need for people to meet. The church will always be a group of people, which will mean there'll always need to be a physical space for them to meet. We could go on a whole nother tangent about VR church, and I don't think that's an answer. That I think there will always be brick and mortar, but it may end up looking a lot more like early church in homes. It may end up looking more shop front churches than established anywhere between cathedral and Walmart style Protestant churches as we know it. But I think there'll always be a need for a physical meeting place, but one that sustains the budgets and salaries and all that it is. I don't think that will survive my lifetime in North America.
Okay, sorry, I just need to pause for a second. I agree with you.
Right.
So I think that part of what we've endeavored to do, even in some of the changes that we've made to the gatherings and different things like that, is make it so that church doesn't revolve so much, hopefully over time, doesn't revolve so much around this building.
Yep.
But that this becomes just a starting point where people then go out and be the body of Christ wherever they are. And that is, I mean, we've as a staff had lots of conversations about how do we help people lean into that future and dreamed about things that we could do to help lean into where we believe God is going.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I agree with you on almost everything, but I just want to ask, why do you think that VR is not legitimate? As the oldest guy on this, do you not think that that is going to become a very real thing?
I think it can and will become a place where some people go for their spiritual feeding, but I think there will always be something that is lacking when the people of Jesus don't come together in community in physical ways. There are so many things that I think are best expressed and I would almost say are necessary to be tangible, from everything from prayer. There's something different with praying on a headset into my microphone versus the call to lay hands on one another and be together, to lift one another up, to visit the sick, to feed the hungry. There are certain things that are not going to be able to be replicated in a VR world. It's a fine substitute for some things, in even some parts of what we do as a community. I heard it at a podcast talking the other day about the future of church and how would you encourage somebody to participate in church now? And he said, find a church that's good at being community. Who cares what their teaching's like? You can get good teaching on a podcast or on YouTube. Get your teaching there. You need a physical meeting of place and community of people. That's more important and harder to get online, which I really agreed with that. Again, people can go to, what is it, Matt Chandler's church that's online, or which one is it? The big one
that started a VR.
Yeah, they had to buy a second VR building, a VR realty space.
That's the part that I'm like, what do you mean you need to?
Why can't you stack them on top of each other?
You could build a balcony in the VR. Yeah. I guess I hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
But we, as humanity, very rarely live out the best case scenario. So I'm not saying that VR is the best case scenario. But I do think that if it doesn't already, for a large number of people in our world, it will become a very legitimate way of doing church, that people will have community. And yes, I'm not saying that it'll be better than in person.
Yeah.
But there will be people who that will be how they choose to have community and how they pray and how they choose to connect with people. Like, I've been in ministry long enough that I can remember when it became okay to start doing pastoral care via texting.
Right.
And nobody even thinks about it anymore.
Yeah.
But there was a time when I would never have done that.
Yeah.
And I can remember the first time that something happened, and I just sent a text to this person because I didn't know where they were, and I knew they wouldn't be able to get a phone call. Yeah. And the response was, pastoral care by text, this is really cool.
Right.
And I was like, I didn't think I was just entering a new paradigm, but I guess I did.
Yeah.
And so that's become legitimate, and people do have community in text groups and in social media and different things like that. And I'm not saying that they're all healthy communities, but you can meet in person and not be in a healthy community.
Totally.
So,
I do hear you. I think it will become an option that people are leaning into more and more. And
Some
I'm not
people.
Saying, and I would say I would have many of the same issues with VR church as I do with megachurch environment, where you can just come in, get what you want, get out, without having the human embodied experience. But there's also continuously studies coming out about the negative impacts of what we're claiming to be social communities online, that they are actually leaving us further and further starving.
I'm not debating any of that. All I'm saying is it's going to happen.
It's going to happen, but I don't think it will be a place where people come. I would be hard-pressed to see it as being real church. I don't know a better way to put it. I think it will always be lacking something massive that can never be fulfilled. If you wanted it as a secondary space,
I think that God is always accommodating, and I think if people want to have church there, God will meet them there as much as they allow.
I do agree with that. That God will work through our human means. But
yes, and so that's all I'm saying. Like I'm not saying the VR churches would be better than in person in any way. I don't think that, because I've heard people, and that's what I thought you were saying, is this would be an illegitimate type of church,
right,
or not real church. And I'm like, I don't think we can't write that off, because for some people that might be, and for a variety of reasons, right? There might be people who can't leave their house.
Totally.
There might be people who, for whatever reason, will not leave their house, and they could find a community of people that could connect with, that technology could allow them to do that. And I just believe God will move through any means that he can move through to reach people.
Totally.
I'm just looking at the question and going, okay,
It's not at all about VR. Is that what you're
No, well, which is fine. I don't mind the VR. I was thinking, I think all of us agree that brick and mortar churches are probably doomed to exist, but I don't think any of us really said why. The question seems to imply that it will be because we have less and less people tithing, which would mean obviously we can't turn on the lights and run the heat bill and pay pastors, right?
Yep.
Is that the reason our churches are doomed to exist?
Because also they will get smaller.
Yeah.
And that's already happening in the United States and Canada. There's churches closing all the time, and COVID only accelerated that.
Yeah.
And so there are some churches that are growing,
Yeah.
but there are a lot of churches that are shrinking,
Yeah.
and there are a lot of churches that close every week.
Yeah.
There are churches that close the doors
Yeah.
for the last time,
Yeah.
and that's just the reality of what it is. And I see this tension in the church today, where there are people who are like, we're closing, and so we need to like fight that.
Yep.
And I see people who are saying, okay, the world is changing, we need to move into that.
Yep.
And I lean more to the latter. We got to lean into with the new. God is always doing something new, and God will move in new ways, in new times, and do new things.
Yep.
If we will allow him to. The Israelites moved into the promised land, and then the manna stopped. And that would have been the scariest day of their lives.
Yeah.
Because for them, though, that whole generation, every person, they would have grown up their whole life. 6 days a week, I get up, I go out of my tent, I collect manna.
Yep.
That's what I do. And the day before Sabbath, I collect 2 days worth of manna.
Yep.
And we know not to collect too much. We know exactly what to do.
Yep.
All of a sudden, like, they go into the promised land, they eat some food, the next day there's no manna.
Yep.
Like, I'm sure the thought would have been, what did we do wrong?
Yep.
How did we sin? Where did we fail, God? Yep. What are we going to do?
Yep.
But it was something God calling them into the new.
Yep.
And I see churches that are resisting and that are fighting and that are going, no, we gotta double down on this, and we gotta like fight for this. And that's where I go, I think that there's massive change that's coming. I mean, Kyle, you and I have had the conversation where I have said to you, I don't know if in your lifetime there will be paid pastors anymore in
completely
your career.
Thinking of that.
And I have friends who don't go to this church, and some who do go to this church that I've talked to and said, you're a pastor. And they're like, I'm not a pastor. And I'm like, yes, you are, because there's people that you are shepherding.
Yep.
You're a pastor. And in 20 years, 30 years, those will be the only pastors.
Yep.
There will not be.
Yep.
Or maybe there will be the few mega churches and large churches.
Yeah.
You might have one or two, or I shouldn't say one or two, because it depends. Like in a city the size of Airdrie, you might have 2 or 3, whereas right now you have 15.
Yep.
Like that's what's going to happen.
Well, that's what I was going to say. There's right now, I feel, already begun. The Walmarting effect is what I've called it. A lot of churches where the small mom and pop shops are closing down and feeding into those people are feeding into the larger churches. And there's a lot of churches living in what I believe is the illusion of their churches are growing, but they're actually just growing on the backs of other churches closing or slowly shrinking into those places, thinking, whoa, look at what God's doing. I'm not to say that God's not also doing good things, but I think that's happening. And then what's going to happen is those other sources are going to dry up. The growth is going to stop, and then the shrivel will continue in that place. And so right now I've watched a number of places. Look at what is happening, and not realizing this is just the canary in the coal mines of what's coming for brick and mortar churches.
There's a movie I saw almost 30 years ago. I was in my teens. And my brother and I went to a drive-in. That's to tell you how long ago it was.
Drive-ins are now retro and cool again.
Do they exist?
Yeah.
Is there one in Calgary?
I don't know about Calgary,
Or
but
do
there's
they
one in
just,
the
like,
area,
pop up?
and they do pop up.
Well, this wasn't a pop-up.
But this is
like-
permanent.
this was.
I went to a real deal one in BC this summer.
Did you really? Wow, BC's a weird place, though.
Yeah, I've done them in BC before.
Is, like, I feel like you could do that in BC because, like, it's retro and BC people would be into it. There used to be one in Calgary.
There did.
I went to it the first couple of years. Lorelei and I went to a movie at the drive-in, and then the hub oil explosion. Now we're way off topic. Anyway, I went to a drive-in, saw a movie.
Yeah.
And it's called, I think it was either called Money or Greed. It starred Danny DeVito. And he was an investment banker who basically watched for companies that the assets of the companies were worth more than the market value of the companies based on their stock price. Then he bought them and just basically liquidated them and made a bunch of money.
Right.
And so he was a liquidator, was what he was. He targets this one company, and the movie is what's happening between him trying to take it over and the people who run this company.
Yeah.
They're trying to defend the company,
Right.
and it ends at this. Stockholder
Spoiler
meeting.
alert.
It's 30 years ago, or 25 years ago. If
I was
you
going to watch it tonight.
it ends at this shareholder meeting
Yeah.
where they're talking about what they're going to do, and Danny DeVito gets up and he says something that has stuck with me my entire life.
Yep.
The surest way to go broke is to own an ever increasing share of an ever decreasing market.
Yep.
He said you can be sure that the last company that made buggy whips made the best buggy whips.
Yep.
But nobody bought buggy whips anymore.
Yep.
And I look at the church, and I look at the trajectory of the church, and I go, there are churches that feel like they're succeeding because, like you say, they're owning an ever-increasing share of a decreasing market.
Yep.
And at the same time, God has called us to stop being this, let's talk about the Sky Justani video you did for the First Donuts and Discussion.
Yep.
I can't remember what it was called. I just remember it was about the megachurch and the rise of the megachurch.
Cruise ships versus.
Yes. Yeah, about cruise ships. We have to get back to what our faith is about. We have to get back to empowering people to do ministry, and we have to get back to discipleship, and we have to learn how to do it outside of this building, or we're all doomed. And I'm talking about us as pastors,
totally.
not the people who are listening,
No.
because they've got jobs. But we have to figure out how to shift ministry, and then at the same time, we've got to slowly and carefully walk the people of our church, and this is what we've endeavored to be doing, into a new paradigm of ministry that says this is actually what biblical Christianity is supposed to be, and we need to get into that. I know it's different than what you've done your whole life. But what you've done your whole life isn't working, and what you've done your whole life wasn't effective, and so we need to make a shift. And as we've endeavored to make some of those shifts, there have been a number of people who've decided they don't want to be a part of that, and they've left, and there's been other people who've decided they do, and they come in. But that's where we have to go back to the being the church, not going to church. That is at its core. The call from the book of Genesis was to be priests. It was lost in the garden when sin entered the world. God tried to restore it in Exodus with the Israelites, and they were like, nope, I'm not into that. And then God tried to do it with the New Testament church, and it was for a long time, but the reality is 2,000 years later, 20 centuries later, we do not see ourselves as priests. We do not understand that as the call of us who are followers of Jesus to go be priests. And instead, we want to go and be priested too. And as long as that is what we're doing, we will never be the countercultural force that will change the world, and we'll continue towards non-existence. But that sounds really discouraging. Christ will not let his church die.
No. And I'm already seeing, and I want to give some encouragement at the end of all this too.
Why? It's all meaningless. We're doomed.
Because I'm seeing some really
Benedict
cool
option. That's a book that everyone should read.
or not.
No, Benedict option is a great.
It was good, but it's basically all right. Board up the windows, pack up because it's gonna get rough.
No, it was not that. He was very depressed. He was very discouraged.
No, the book was excellent.
It was
I'm painting it with broad strokes for
sure.
sure.
No, but it was that the war's over and we've lost.
Yeah.
But what do we do now?
Yeah, and I'm seeing really cool and creative and inventive and fruitful church initiatives start in a number of different ways. I know a number of years ago, Francis Chan left his megachurch to start a movement where he was teaching then young leaders to be doing home churches. I think you'll see more of that, where what would be a church pastor now will be a pastor of a network of home churches. That's one option. I'm seeing a number of churches endeavor to become community centers, either in like running coffee shops and art centers and all that in their community, and use their building as multi-purpose and happen to have a meeting space on Sunday at some point. I've got a friend in BC, shout out to Brent and what they're doing. They've got 3 to 4 different churches that use their building as their church, that then I think 3 of them are lay-led, but they as a church get then to share this one space for multiple different churches to meet of different ethnicities, but also are blending them together in really beautiful ways. So there's really cool new stuff happening. I know
Yes, absolutely.
coffee stores that then close on Saturday after they close, open as a church Sunday, and then go reopen as Monday as a church again, or as a coffee shop again. Like there's really creative things happening that give me a lot of hope. But church as we know it will not just perpetually be a building reserved for Sunday programs, and maybe a few other things sprinkled like that with multiple paid staff pastors. But we'll get creative.
And I'll just say, we've talked about how can we do that and how can we help people.
Yep.
We as a staff do that. Yep. So if somebody's like, well, I would like to start a home church, I would love to be a part of something.
Yep.
Talk to us. We would love to be able to figure out how we could help you and assist you to do that, because we do see that as part of what is on our heart to be able to do.
Well, this Saturday as well, since our Saturday nights have been closed, our first group that people needed to meet on Saturdays, or it was best for them to meet on Saturdays, started meeting in our church while we weren't here, and they had 30 people at a home. And then if it grows, they're going to start meeting here potentially, of lay-led with us backing them up, within our own community, within our own building. But
I do know that there's people who are not part of Living Springs.
Yeah.
Who
don't even live here.
Who
that listen to the podcast.
Just because you may not live in Airdrie and you may listen to the podcast, you may be thinking, I would like to do something. I don't know where to start. Yeah. I would encourage you to reach out to us. We would love to see if there's some way that we could help you do that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So. I think of the money part of it too. I think of, what money typically goes to keep a church running. And I think of, if that wasn't the case, like what could that money be used for? Because I still think there's a call, like, I'm looking at the question is like, should we, encourage younger members maybe to tithe more? Well, depending on what your understanding of tithe is, but there is biblical precedence, or Jesus said, where your treasure, or where your heart is, there your treasure will be. Also, is that it, or do I got it backwards? Sorry, but
where your treasure is, there your heart will be.
There your heart will be. Yes.
Same thing.
So I think, if you are doubling up on spaces such as coffee shops or things, or even your home, then obviously the money that you would have to give, or that you would feel obligated to give, or you'd want to give to Jesus, could be used for better things.
Totally.
Right? Like, I think that could happen.
Yeah. I think I think there's a purifying that needs to happen with church budgets, right? That Eugene Peterson in Reverse Thunder, I was just in it last week preparing for the long-form teaching. He talks about the sea beast within Revelation to actually be religion that blows itself up and inflates itself so high that it needs to feed itself with these massive budgets to keep worship going. We've gotten there. When you look at church budgets that are 85, 90% between salaries and production costs, we've gotten there in a lot of circumstances to do that. And yes, to simplify some of how we spend our money is part of it too. That, yeah.
If I could just defend those people, although I may not even agree with them.
Yeah.
I think it's easy to just get into that mindset that you
totally
go, this is how ministry happens, and you do something. You do something.
Yeah.
And people go, that was awesome.
Yeah.
So then you want to do something
Yep.
again, and then you want to do something again, and then it can become this. You end up with a production. I've seen YouTube videos of churches that are doing Cirque du Soleil acts as part of their Sunday morning service, or the stage. They would have spent thousands of dollars on stage renovations for a 4-week series.
Yep.
I can see how churches can get there.
Absolutely.
I genuinely can, because you
and out of
do
best
something.
intentions.
Yes, you do something.
Totally.
And you see the response, and you're like, okay, now we have to outdo it. Now we have to do it. And if you scale back from that, people go, what's the problem?
Yep.
Like, I now expect this, right?
Yep.
And so I can totally see how it can happen in any church. It's hard to lead people.
Yeah.
And I don't say that as a pastor. I say that as a person.
Yep.
I say that as someone who at times has to be led.
Yep.
And we all have our opinions and we all have our thoughts. When you are in a church that did this thing and people are like, that was amazing, how is there not subtle pressure?
Yeah.
Now you have to outdo that.
I've chatted with a friend who's a worship pastor at a church, and They finished their Christmas Eve, which was always their big thing. It was his first Christmas Eve there. Pastor came, patted him on the back. That was awesome. Let's get started on how much better next year's going to be. And I would just like completely deflated him. Like there wasn't even a minute or a week of like,
At least give him
that was
Christmas
really
Day
good,
off.
right? But it was like, all right, let's start planning for next year because of how good that was. We need to
Yeah.
supersede that, right? And then,
And I'll be honest, I felt that
Yep.
just in preaching. Like I went through this season where I said to Laura Lee, when someone says to me good sermon,
yeah,
I just take it as like it became for me this. I hated it.
Right.
I resented it.
Right.
Because all of a sudden there was this pressure.
Right.
Now that next week's got to be better, and Laura Lee was like, that's not what they're saying. And she helped me to realize that I was taking it wrong. It had nothing to do with the person, and I'm not blaming anybody.
No.
It was a Doug issue.
yeah,
But just in my humanity,
Yep.
I took a compliment, and it became this thing that I went through a season where I hated preaching. I would always be fine when I got up there to do it.
Yeah.
But there were countless weeks that when we used to have a coffee time during our service,
Yeah.
in the middle of the service, I would sit down beside Laura Lee during coffee time and go, I don't know if I can do this. Like I would feel so much pressure because people liked last week and people thought the story last week was good, and I don't have a good story this week. And
right.
it's not my job to tell them stories. It's my job to help them see Jesus through the Word of God, through the Scriptures.
Which, and nothing against your teaching, Doug, but I think that's also something that as churches shift, one of the other beautiful things I've seen start coming up is even our church and other Protestant churches or evangelical churches starting to lean into more liturgy and practices that have gone along with the church, because having a central person be the central point of teaching is, I don't think, any longer going to be what we all look to. I think, well, again, there'll be a refreshing back to the Eucharist and communion together. I think there'll be practices and liturgies and prayer that become common, and we don't need the dynamic leader as much as this shift continues into where church is heading.
I think there's going to be a merging of the two. It's not going to go back. Things never go back. They only ever move forward.
Yeah.
So you will see house churches that gather together and they will do communion together, because that's important.
Yep.
But what you will also see is you will see people who are good teachers in new mediums, whether it's through YouTube or whether it's through online or whether it's through something you buy, that can present something so that the person in the house doesn't have to be the teacher.
Totally.
Right? And then I think they'll probably be shorter. I think it'll be like a TED Talk. And then there'll be more conversation. And that's even what we've endeavored to do with some of the changes we've made in this gathering and some of the things we've talked about. Could we do this to help people in a different
Even this podcast
format? Well, but there's not a lot of opportunity but to do a 10-minute that you could press a play on a video. People will not go back to the 1930s. People will not go back to the 1700s and just have a liturgy. I mean, some people will, and great, good for them. But most people today have grown accustomed to teaching online. I mean, how many people are listening to this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google, YouTube, whatever, right?
Totally.
That we're totally good with getting our teaching from somewhere else. So what will happen, I think, is a merging of the two. I don't think it'll go back just to the other.
That's a better way to put it, but I think those will give new life within a new environment to some of those communal and congregational practices more than have to have one person as the central focus.
And we won't call that person the pastor.
Right.
Because what I always remember what Andy Stanley said. You know, in the church, if you can talk good, they let you lead.
Yeah.
Always.
And it's true, right? And we say we want a pastor. What we really want is a preacher. And then sometimes churches get a preacher, and then they're like, but you're not a very good pastor.
Totally. Josie commented, and I'll read it out just because it's fun having live feedback. And Josie commented, I have to mention that when I was in Russia, no one was allowed to sightsee in the churches on Sunday in order not to disturb the services. Yes, in Russia, she said. So
Interesting.
And I think, I would imagine in Rome and in other places, they would have services in some of those churches. I don't know every church, but they would have. But I know that every day they're open with an offering box to get a couple of bucks to keep them going if you walk through.
Right. There you go.
I was just thinking as you guys are speaking of, I think I preached on this years ago. It's funny, my Bible's open to Nehemiah, and that was not on purpose. But preaching out of Nehemiah, when he rebuilds the temple, he gives them, if I remember right, like 4 rules. And a couple of them were make sure that the Levites or the priests don't have to work.
Right.
Because if they go off to the field to work, then their interests are divided, you have no leaders, and you will fall back to the way that has happened before. And he's just talking about what has happened in Israel's history. And I always thought, yeah, that's so true. Like, we need to preserve the church. We need to preserve pastors and all this because we need leaders to lead us that way. But as we're speaking right here, I'm like, I don't know if I totally believe that anymore. Like, I think it's easy to fall into that. It's an old paradigm that we think, well, if I pay my tithe or I pay my money, then someone else is going to do my spiritual work for me. And I think that all of us would agree at this table, that is not a good recipe for following Christ.
Yep. Yep.
We have to put in the effort. And yeah, I think, unfortunately, churches are ceasing to exist in the way we see them because people are figuring that out, that either, paying into that system is not helping their spirituality, or they just don't care enough to want to do that anymore.
Yep.
And it's a system that doesn't work real well, right?
Yeah, but remember, Nehemiah is speaking into a system that exists because the people of Israel refused to be priests.
Yeah, that's
Right?
exactly it. Yeah.
So you do need a group of people who do that because nobody wanted to fulfill their own duty and the God-given mandate on every person's life to be a priest.
Yeah.
And so we need these people, right? And that's where I think there's going to be a purification in the church where what's going to happen is that people who are passengers in the church are going to go, you know what, I don't need to be a passenger anymore. And we saw that during COVID.
Yep.
There were some people who shifted and went to different churches for a variety of reasons. There's some people who just stopped going to church. Yep. I can remember 6 months into COVID, 1/3 of your church is still with you, 1/3 of your church is now watching a different church or going to a different church, and 1/3 of your church has stopped attending altogether.
Yep.
And they're not coming back unless God does something spectacular in their life or they find themselves in some faith crisis that they're going to be like, I need to get back to church.
Yep.
And I think it's also in Nehemiah when you say that. Isn't it in Nehemiah when the older people see the temple being built, they weep because it's nothing compared to the new?
Yeah, totally.
I think of that and I think about this where we are right now.
Yeah.
That there are people who are looking back at what was and weeping and going, no, we need to have that again instead of saying, okay, there's something new.
Yeah.
True. All right, we got through
That was some good. I'm sure we could talk more.
I want to say one more
40
thing,
minutes.
though. I do want to say one more thing. I don't know who asked this question.
Yeah.
But I just want to say I don't know that young church members tithe less or give less.
Okay.
I don't know that that's a thing.
Right.
I know a lot of very generous young people who give sacrificially, but a couple of things. Number one, they don't feel compelled to give to the church. They give where they see the need.
Yep.
And number two, they don't make as much money as people who are more established in their careers. Yep. So I want to defend the younger people who are there because I know there are young people who are very generous and there are old people who are not.
Right.
And so I don't want to make it sound like a generalization, like if the young people would just pull their weight, we'd be fine. Because that's not, it is a different world, and young people are more likely to give to a GoFundMe as much as to the church.
Right.
Yeah, that's true. Very true. All right, so next question. Why do you think that God created the spiritual realm to be not as consistently tangible as the physical world that we experience daily? Physical world meaning our 5 senses.
I wonder if he did, or if this is the result of sin. We are dull. Like when you think about the Garden of Eden.
I would completely agree. It was supposed to be the meeting place between the two.
Yes, when you think about the Garden of Eden and God walking among the garden and God walking with him, God, like that's an anthropomorphism. I don't believe that it was necessarily Jesus, a pre-incarnate Jesus walking with them, but there was a merging. The two lived in union and in harmony.
Yep.
And sin broke that.
And that's the promise in Revelation of the new Jerusalem comes down
with a city and a garden.
And so it's the two coming together again that I think the intention was they were supposed to be a meeting place between the temple of Eden was supposed to be in what will be the city of Zion or city of the new Jerusalem will be the meeting place between those two realms that are both worshiping Yahweh for who he is.
And if you take the Michael Heiser kind of thinking,
Yeah.
then whatever, years ago or sometime in history, then there was the supernatural more interactive with the world, right? So, interesting.
So I think that I tend to think this is the result of sin and the dullness. A.W. Tozer said, if you were transported right now directly into the throne room of God, you would not be more in his presence than you are right now.
Yep.
We a fundamental core Christian truth that we would say if somebody doesn't believe it, they're a heretic, genuinely, not jokingly, is God is omnipresent.
Yep.
Yeah.
David says in Psalm, I can't remember which one, where can I go out from your presence, right? If I go to heaven and you are there, if I make my bed in Sheol, the place of the dead, you are there. There's nowhere I can go apart from your presence, right? So David, this guy who is a man after God's own heart, he learned to live more and more and more in the presence of God. I fast forward, I think of Brother Lawrence. I think of Frank Laubach. Frank Laubach's book, Letters from a Modern Mystic. I can't remember Brother Lawrence's book, Practicing the Presence of God. These guys who walked in the presence of God constantly. The problem is not on heaven's end. The problem is on our end. I even think about the two Old Testament verses. One says, the whole earth is filled with the glory of the Lord. And then another prophet says the whole earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. The problem is not that the glory of the Lord is not shining. The problem is that we don't know it, that we are blind to it.
Yeah, and I would say, I know as I say this, what you guys think. You grew up in charismatic churches. I did not. But my first experiences of the Holy Spirit, even in church services, and I know we could talk about how that happens too, but I think that is like a noticing of like, oh, wow, like God is real and he is here, right? And as you walk that out, yes, then you become more and more aware of this presence, right?
But the danger in the charismatic church was that we only thought God was there during a worship service.
Yeah, and you seek the experience, right? Like that becomes the thing rather than Jesus or...
Well, and instead of lifting our eyes to see God, we wait for music to move us and make us feel something.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
And so they're not necessarily the same.
No, but I'm saying I think it's the same thing in what those people experience, you know, especially for a first time in those settings, is real. Right. I think that is experiencing the presence of God that they have not tasted or seen before, and all of a sudden they're like, oh my, right? Yeah. But yes, the danger to that is then you can fall into a rut seeking after that all the time. Yeah.
Somebody was telling me not too long ago that the first time they walked into our church, they just cried the entire time. I can't remember who it was, and they were like, I just cried and cried and cried, and I didn't know why. And then someone said to me, "That's God," right? And it wasn't just it wasn't that they were moved by music, and the Spirit can use music, but music can also just move us. And so we need to recognize that both of those statements are true. But this person didn't just be moved during a certain song. They just came into this place where they felt love and they felt the presence of God among the people of God. And they sat and cried through the entire service and said, I need to start going to that church. And that was how they started coming.
Cool. I think sometimes we've misunderstood and we've believed the spiritual realm and the physical realm to be binary to one another and completely separate. I think that's not a biblical idea. I think the two are more connected than we believe. There's things that we do in the physical realm that are welcoming God's spiritual realm and reign. And there are things that happen in the spiritual realm that have physical, tangible effects on this world. Paul talks about that, who we're fighting. And so I think to say heaven up there or hell below is completely separate than our five senses is also a misnomer. That the two worlds are very connected. And so when you get into places where spiritual effects or spiritual dominions, whatever you want to call it, are strong, you then see physical, tangible effects with that. It's not a separate thing that I'm just feeling, but there's an actual physical effect of that. You look at the constant question is, well, why are miracles happening more in Africa or you name it than they are here? I don't think the spiritual realm is more present there. I think people are more aware of it, more welcoming of it, and that then has physical effects. And so, back to Doug, what you're saying, it's our dulling and our lack of awareness of it But at the same time, when we pray, there's something that happens in the spiritual and physical realm. We pray spiritually for physical things to happen, that those are much more connected than we often think of them or talk about them.
Yeah,
I wanted to draw that
It
parallel.
just made me think of the armor of God passage, right?
Yeah.
For we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the authorities and principalities of this world, or darkness, sorry. And I think it's not saying like maybe you might notice that someday. It's like, no, this is real. This is your struggle, right? So it's much more present than we probably notice, as this question suggests, right? That we can walk around in this world and never think that the spiritual realm even exists, right?
As we've
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, as we've talked here before, and bring it up again, the tests of our salvation in the New Testament are always about works that we have done. And so to go and to feed the hungry, to go and visit those in prison, to go and do all these things is a spiritual and physical act simultaneously that is, you can see and feel the kingdom of God at work when that is being lived out. And again, it is both spiritual and physical, not one or the other, that we welcome the kingdom as we do those things in both realms.
I'll give you a perfect example of that. Cornelius.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Cornelius was a man who was generous. Yeah. And literally, I think it's when the angel appeals to Cornelius, he's like, God has seen your offerings to the poor. Yeah. And because of that, basically what he says is, you're going to be the first Gentile Christian.
Yep.
And it was because he prayed and this very physical act that we don't recognize. Yeah. But I would also say that part of the problem has been how we've presented the gospel to people.
Completely.
And we were talking just an hour ago about different long-form teaching ideas. Maybe one on the gospel would be a great idea. Because what do we tell people? If you accept Jesus, you can go to heaven when you die.
Yep.
Which we teach people, the church, the leadership of the church has taught people for the last, my entire life, I'll just say that. I don't know how long before, my entire life, that the core message of the gospel is about this heaven that is sometime after you, like sometime in the future, because you're not dead yet. Yeah. So at some point in the future, you will experience heaven, versus the message of John the Baptist and Jesus, who repeats the message of John the Baptist in the book of Matthew, repent for the kingdom of heaven is near.
Yep. Yeah.
Right? We have totally turn the whole thing around, and instead of saying, come into heaven, embrace heaven, like let's live into heaven right now, and let's enjoy the first fruits of it while we wait for the fullness of it, we've said, basically it's like a pension.
Yeah, totally. Do all these things so you can get your ticket into the pie in the sky place. Yep.
But you don't pay into your pension with any expectation it's going to make a difference in your life today.
Totally.
It's funny how you say that, because we may have preached it here. I'll ask you, but I'm sure I've heard sermon titles or sermon series, and maybe here, I know I've seen them in other churches, right? That is like this correction of, okay, like, no, it's heaven now, right? Like we're going to teach you that you're actually in the kingdom of heaven now. And I think we're doing all these corrective teachings, and I just don't know that anybody's believing it, right? Like I think people are sitting there and they're like, that's interesting, but you told me I get to heaven at the end.
It's a lot of work to undo people's patterns of thinking. Like I've had the privilege to be sitting and studying in this for years, and I'm still barely getting I still have to keep catching myself, let alone when we get 25 minutes to talk to people about a myriad of topics.
Totally,
do we have even a hope of rechanging them? And then they go back and listen to a podcast or sermon from somebody else, read their Bibles with that frame of mind and reinforce. Like there is so much work to undo that culturally in our own environment, and how much time it would take to do that for me, let alone anybody else.
Lorelei and I were talking I think it was after the Revelation long form teaching night.
Yeah.
And she made this very astute observation, because I was talking about how we were presenting something very different than what people have typically heard. And she said, but whatever you hear first is what is, like that's now your default.
Totally.
And shifting off of that is exceedingly difficult. Yeah. I've thought many times, like, Karl Barth wrote that book. What was it? His book wasn't Dogmatic. Was it?
He wrote Dogmatics. Yep.
Sorry, I was
it's
confusing
like
that.
9 volumes.
I was confusing that and Augustine's Confessions, the two titles. He wrote Dogmatic, where he just laid out like this massive work of theology. Yeah. And I was thinking, not on anywhere close to that scale, but I was like, it would be a worthwhile endeavor to create some sort of book that said, Okay, forget everything you've ever learned. Now start referencing this.
Yeah.
Right? Every time you're wanting to know a question on any of these big issues of faith, forget everything you've learned and read this.
Yeah.
Because the problem, Scott McKnight, the Blue Parakeet, we approach the Bible with all of our biases and all, because that's the only way we can.
Yeah.
Right? And so to have this, it'd be nice to have this book that just says, okay, I thought, like, what is the Bible? What is God like? What does salvation really mean? What is the gospel? Heaven, what is heaven, and what is hell? And just cover like if we could just get on the same page on some of those things. That'd be beautiful.
Well, I'm reading The Day the Revolution Began by N.T. Wright again right now. And he constantly is going to these verses like, we've been taught that this means you go to heaven when you die because Jesus died to get in the way of God's wrath against what he was going to do to you. And he goes to these verses and goes, yep, this is what we read this. Read the context around this one. And that has just been butchering of what that verse was saying in the context of its whole thing. Because
we just take that one verse.
Yeah, and then we keep going back and we read that verse and we reinforce what we assume it means when we're, so it's just getting stronger and stronger because it's what we first heard.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that I said that this week when I preached the Revelation, like preaching out of chapter 4 and 5, I said in the gathering, and I meant it was real, how many times I've read Revelation, many, many times in my life. I enjoy that book and read right over chapter 4 and 5 because that's the non-interesting part. Like, honestly, this is... Yeah, it's like, oh, heaven.
I want to get to the good stuff.
Heaven, good, God's in heaven, right. Okay, what
Beasts
about the
and dragons?
What about the future? What about the beasts? What about the dragons, right? And so I'm just as bad or as drink the Kool-Aid or whatever you want to call it as anybody else.
No,
right?
we all are.
Yeah,
We all
all
are.
of
You're no
us.
different than everybody else. We all do. The only way we can approach the Bible, and this is why you need to approach the Bible with an open heart that is allowing the Spirit to lead you, because it's the Spirit who guides us into truth. Those are the words of Jesus, not mine.
Amen.
It's not the Bible that guides us into truth. It is the Spirit that guides us into truth. Yes, the Spirit wants to use the Bible, and that's one of the main ways that he can, if we will engage with the Bible, and that's a whole other issue. But we have to approach it like a student and like someone who doesn't know and like someone who's allowing the Holy Spirit to speak, instead of going, okay, I'm going to read this because I want to just remind myself of all the things that I already know.
And do it in community so we can help remind each other of that is another important part, that I can't do it on my own, and I'm so quickly needing to be reminded over and over again of these truths that I'll even read it. It's embarrassing to say how often I'll read something or do my morning prayer and then quickly flip right back. I've been saying to Allie all last few weeks as we were preparing for the long-form teaching, I was so much more dragon today than lamb. So much more dragon than lamb. And I can remind myself and be studying this book and then quickly flip back into, let alone my patterns of thinking.
Well, and back to this question then, that just shows us how real the spiritual realm is.
Absolutely.
Right? There is spiritual fighting and all the rest and darkness and an enemy, right? Like all those things are real and it's not far off, right? It is present. So,
and we are whole beings, spiritual all the time, just as much as we are physical, we are spiritual, that we can't separate those. And it's absolutely real. We just ignore it.
Yep.
We don't have.
We got
time.
2 questions done today.
So good. I think we got time to sneak in one more if we sneak down to 122.
122.
We can sneak down there and have that done in 7 minutes.
All right. Doug, what's the deal with you and soup? I have heard this many times now, but I don't get it.
Kyle, did your wife submit this?
I don't know. This one came in anonymously. It very well may have been. My wife, the defender of the name and integrity of soup.
Okay, here's the deal with soup. I want my drink in my glass, I want my food on my plate, and I don't want you to mix the two. I don't want you to take a tiny little bit of chicken and mix it in a bowl of hot water and call it a meal. It's not. If I have chicken, I have like 2 chicken breasts, and then I have like a full potato, and then I have a salad as well. If you put it in a bowl of water, you can give me like a third of a chicken breast, 16 noodles, and 4 peas, and you call it a meal. No, it's not. It's hot water that's got dirt in it. Like, you wouldn't, like, how is soup different?
It's a chicken's bath leftovers.
How is soup different than just, after you wash the dishes, scooping that out, putting it on the stove, and turning it on and warming it up? It's water with food in it. It's the same thing.
If you're making your soup with water, you are off to a bad start.
There's
But
water in all soup.
most of them are broth.
What is broth made out of?
It's boiled and boiled and boiled and boiled and
According to Doug,
juice.
it's made out of sink water. You've
broth,
done your dishes
broth
first.
is flavored water. You have just bought into the you're just bought into the soup lie, man. Quit believing the soup propaganda.
I don't have as harsh an opinion as you on soup, but I have many times in my life like had soup and gone, okay, now where's the meal? Like as an appetizer, fine, but if that's my main course, I'm like, I feel hungry still. Like,
See, here's the difference between you and me, Blake, is you're just nice enough to not say it. I'm just the guy who's honest enough to say what you're thinking.
I've either been conditioned
the bullet
or
for it, it's
brainwashed long enough that I've come to enjoy soup. But where do you stand on chili then? Is chili more substantive?
Yeah, and
It depends how watery the chili
or stew?
is.
and there's a big difference between the way my mom made soup out of a can with 6 strings of noodles and a little piece of chicken, and the way my wife makes soup, which is like just hearty and full. And
That's the
much
way
more
my
like-
wife makes
much
it,
more
yeah.
like chili.
And then you get done and you think, where's the meal?
Well, still sometimes yes, but it is more substantial than just drinking the broth. So, yeah.
I won't try to make a case to convince you, but I've come to really enjoy soup. That's all I'll say.
You have to, because your wife makes soup.
I don't
and
have
you-
another choice. I would
you-
starve if
you
I didn't eat
love
soup in
your
my house.
wife. I wasn't going to say you have to because you'll starve. You love your wife, and the two become one. And this is an example of it, just not in a good way.
Allie, we got some talking to do, I guess.
Oh man, thank you guys for tuning in. Keep sending the questions. You might learn some interesting things here on our Q&A podcast.
Awesome.
This has been the Living Springs Q&A podcast. If you have a question you would like answered or would like to learn more, visit us at livingspringsairdrie.com. Thanks for tuning in.